4 years after independence, our independence, we can honestly say that we are a failed state and we are in a mess. It is most unfortunate that that is the reality. I think if one has got to be honest, we started on the wrong foot. Zimbabwe's founding fathers, Robert Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo, and all the other black nationalists, never really wanted the people of Zimbabwe, the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, to have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. When Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo went to the Lancaster House talks in 1979, they had made a repeated attempt to to go in as a united front. Unfortunately, that did not happen. They had formed the Patriotic Front, but the mistrust between the two parties was such that it did not hold. So in the end, they went to the Lancaster House as two separate parties. If they had gone in as one party, we can be certain of one thing. They would have wanted Zimbabwe to have a one party, to be a one party state from the word go. And so, in that regard, they were not united. They went in and they agreed to the Lancaster House talks agreement, which formed a multi party democratic Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe and his cronies were never committed to a multi party system. Indeed, the Lancaster House talks, which is what I'm showing there in the photograph, um, photograph of the signing in ceremony, with Robert Mugabe on the far uh, left hand side, followed by Dr. Joshua Nkomo and others. When Robert Mugabe and his cronies went back to Zimbabwe after the signing of the Lancaster House talks, they had no intention of um, honoring the Lancaster House agreement. They went back to Zimbabwe, and instead of honoring the commitment to withdraw all their freedom operatives from the field and sending them to assembly points, they kept a number of their operatives in the field. And they were instructed that their campaign message to the people was to make it very clear that if Zanu PF does not win the election, the bush war would continue. Of course, the ordinary people voted to end the bush war. What else do they have? What else could they have done? They'd endured so much suffering during the bush war, they really did not want to see it continue. But admittedly, you cannot say that was a free, fair, and credible election. If you're voting with a gun pointed to your temples. Some people have argued that that was just a campaign strategy for Zanu PF. The truth of the matter is it wasn't. As events soon proved. In 1983, Zanu PF launched its Kukuraundi massacre. The primary purpose of that was to coerce Dr. Ngomo and his PF Zapu friends and their followers to give up the ambition of having an independent political party which could contest for office. The unity accord that had failed in the form of the Patriotic Front was now being pursued in another way. The Gukurahundi massacre lasted until 1987, after an estimated 20,000 people, mostly civilians, had been killed. Finished with Joshua Nkomo and his friends signing the Unity Accord, which paved the way for Robert Mugabe to launch the de facto one-party state that he had always wanted. Zimbabwe has remained a de facto one-party state to this day. Robert Mugabe and company never had any illusions of making sure that people had a meaningful say in the governance of the country. They didn't care about that. They have ridden roughshod over the people's freedoms and fundamental rights, including the right to a meaningful vote and even the right to life. The comparison between Zimbabwe's founding fathers and that of the USA, for instance, could not have been more stark. The two were coming from totally different angles, facing in totally different directions. America's founding fathers were committed to making post-independent America a democratic nation in which power was to be invested in the people. This is the reality that most people have failed to appreciate in the case of Zimbabwe. I'm sorry to okay, we're still live streaming. We seem to be having a problem with the Twitter stream. This is the reality. If you look at the American Constitution, the very starting three words say it all. We, the people, affirming that the government existed to serve its citizens. And the supremacy of the people's power was that they elected representatives in a free, fair, and credible electoral process. In the case of the Zanu PF, like I said, the very first election, the party was making it very clear that if the party did not win the elections, the Bush war would continue. There was no pretense that they were interested in free, fair, and credible elections. Yes, some people have argued that yes, it's because they didn't trust the British to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Well, 1985, it was Zanu PF that organized the elections. And as we all know, the 1985 elections were held in the middle of the Gukurawundi War. The violence was rampant. The killings were unbelievable. Zanu PF was not interested in free, fair, credible elections. And even after signing the Unity Accord, the elections in Zimbabwe have never been free, fair, and credible. And so we have been stuck with a regime that had no commitment whatsoever to making sure, to honoring the people's basic fundamental rights and freedoms. It was a rallying call before independence, one man, one vote, for instance. But clearly, as the war progressed, as we got nearer to the 1980 elections, Zanu PF had abandoned that call completely. It wanted power, absolute power. And ever since Zanu PF got into power, the regime has shown that its commitment to holding on to power was so intense, it would rather see the country, burn the country down to ashes than to see anybody else rule the country. And so we have found ourselves in a situation where 44 years after independence, we are still failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections because Zanu PF keep on to blatantly rig elections. Yes, there cannot be any denying that Zanu PF rigged the 2023 elections, albeit in this case with the help of the corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless opposition. There have been many opportunities in the last 44 years to implement democratic reforms which would have stopped Zanu PF rigging elections. But none of those reforms have ever been implemented because they were impossible, but because the opposition were corrupt and incompetent. So in 2013, the then GNU, comprising Zanu PF and the two MDC factions, had another goal at writing a constitution, the 2013 constitution. Well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That new constitution, as much as the opposition went to great lengths to try to persuade the ordinary people that it was a democratic constitution, it was not. Zanu PF's Paul Mangwana, who was on the committee that drafted the constitution, boasted soon after the referendum that approved that constitution that Mugabe dictated that constitution. And no one in their right mind could expect Mugabe to dictate a democratic constitution. Of course, it wasn't. was typical of Mugabe to allow the rights to demonstrate, the rights to do this, the right to do that in one part of the constitution, and then in the next, take all those rights away. And this is why the 2013 election, the 2013 constitution is so weak and feeble. And indeed, some can even say utterly useless. And indeed, it is utterly useless. It has failed to deliver the most basic requirement that one would expect a constitution to deliver: free, fair, and credible elections. And ever since its approval, when Zanu PF managed to get back into power, the regime has started eating back on whatever was in that constitution that was of any value by amendment, one amendment after another. The commitment to have a democratic Zimbabwe was never there. And I think that is at the heart of our problem. The other problem, of course, is that the people themselves, the ordinary Zimbabweans, were not educated, knowledgeable, and diligent. At least not educated, knowledgeable, and diligent enough to make sure that Zanu PF honored and respected the rights and freedoms of all the citizens. Even when the opposition got into power, the people themselves failed to realize that the opposition was selling out. This has not helped our situation one bit. Even last year, it was clear that without reforms, Zanu PF was going to rig the elections again. It was clear that without reforms, it was absolutely meaningless for people to participate, particularly when they know if you participate, all you'll be succeeding in doing is giving Zanu PF legitimacy. And yet, Nelson Chamisa was able to tell the people that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. And so Triple C was going to win big, which in the end, of course, did not happen. He was lying. And how the people themselves could fail to see through some of those blatant lies beggars belief. But that is the problem with our system. The ruling party had no commitment to free, fair, and credible elections and good governance. The opposition, as soon as they got into power, they started enjoying the benefits of high office and they forgot all about reforms. And they've been participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. And then the people themselves have not been smart enough to know what they want, to know what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections, and to demand that elections should be free, fair, and credible, and to hold those in positions of power and authority to democratic account. So the cocktail of all those three weaknesses, key players being weak, is what has landed Zimbabwe into this mess. How are we going to get out? In my view, at the present moment, there cannot be any debate on Zanu PF implementing reforms. Zanu PF will never reform itself out of office. The opposition, constituting some of these MDC leaders whose name have been changing from MDC to MDC Alliance, to Triple C, and God knows what is going to come next. I don't think any of these opposition leaders will ever implement any meaningful reforms. And that is the truth. As much as we want the reforms to be implemented, those guys have given up on reforms. What I expect Chamisa to do once he has relaunched his party is make the same empty promises that he has implemented, um, winning in rigged election strategies to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. And alas, I would not be surprised that millions of ordinary Zimbabweans will believe him again and participate in flawed elections and thus give the regime legitimacy. So the best hope for the country right now is that the people should realize the sheer futility of participating in these flawed elections. And they must put their foot down and demand that they will not participate in flawed elections. I believe if people had done that last year, SADC would have denied Zanu PF political legitimacy. And if people do it in 2028, but that process has got to start now, it will have the same effect. SADC, as a regional body, has realized the sheer futility and the problems that Zimbabwe has caused to the whole region because of its political, never-ending political and economic crisis. I believe SADC would do the right thing and deny Zanu PF political legitimacy if we do our part and stop participating in these flawed elections. Before I close, I'll just show one comment from one of the listeners out there. This is from CF. He's saying they just wanted to remove the whites and get the system to work for them only and not for the masses. I could not agree with you more. That is exactly what Zanu PF wanted. And when Triple C, MDC people were elected into office, they too decided that as long as they get a share of the spoils of power, they were not going to remove Zanu PF. In fact, ever since the GNU debacle, MDC leaders have participated in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, that participating will only give Zanu PF legitimacy. But they've continued to do so out of greed. Thank you, CF, for your comment. Now, before I go, I think I'll just want to close with playing. This is my favorite video clip, a clip from Dr. Nevas Mumba talking about what Zimbabweans should really do. If we are serious about about solving our political problems, about making sure that next elections are not a repeat of 2023. This is what he had to say. And for those who may not be aware, Dr. Nevas Mumba was the chairperson of the SADC Election Observer Mission of the 2023 Zimbabwe elections.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me be clear that the changing of any dynamic or situation in any of our African countries is a preserve of the citizens of that country, in this case, the Zimbabwean people. An election observation team goes there to support the process by observing and being able to release a statement of our observations that, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we raised several issues of transparency and also the independence of the Electoral Commission and things which happen in many other countries, But at the end of the day, once we produce the report and make it available to the Zimbabwean authorities and eventually to the Zimbabwean people, it really remains the preserve of the Zimbabwean people to fight for the freedoms that they need themselves and to correct those issues that have been observed. The reason why we have multiple observation missions is to ensure that, there is a comparison, taking place between the SADC report and the European Union report, the African Union report. And then they can see that those issues that repeat themselves in all these reports, it's up to the Zimbabwean people. And this is where I appeal to all political leaders, not only in Zimbabwe, especially the elections that are coming in Mozambique, that are coming in South Africa, in DRC. We have to make up our minds that, look, at the end of the day, once the people in the country are given an opportunity to monitor the elections, because they also monitor, it starts not during the day of the elections. They must make sure that the constitutional lacunas that can affect a good election are dealt with months before the election. And they must fight to ensure that there's a level playing field. They should never wait for the time when the election is taking place. They must also insist that the electoral commissions and the governments in those countries abide by international norms in holding democratic elections. And this fight must be more vicious before the election comes.
I could not agree with him more strongly. I think the fight to make sure that we do not repeat the same mistake of 2023 of participating in flawed elections must be our own fight. We must make sure that we do not fall victim of smart aleck individuals who come and promise that they've plugged all the vote-rigging loopholes and we should participate, when we know that without implementing the democratic reforms, participating in these flawed elections would only perpetuate the dictatorship. We had a wrong start. We started on the wrong foot. We had the wrong founding fathers. We had no commitment to democratic principles. We know that. We also know that we had opposition parties whose commitment to implementing reforms was not total. They were easily bought off and they forgot about the reforms. We know that. We also know that we, the people, have been weak in the sense that we have allowed all these treasonous acts by the ruling party and then the opposition to take place. We must make sure that that does not happen again. Zimbabwe can be turned around. A Japanese scholar and writer, Ken Yamamoto, once said that Zimbabwe could become the South Korea of Africa in terms of economic development, and freedom for the citizens and economic prosperity. I believe he was right. It is not too late. We can still turn this nation around. Zimbabwe can still aspire to be rich, prosperous, in which all our citizens enjoy the fundamental rights and freedoms. But we must first put right our flawed electoral political system. And that must start by insisting that we have democratic reforms before 2028, or we do not participate in the 2028 elections. That is the first step in changing Zimbabwe and bringing about real, meaningful change to Zimbabwe. 44 years of rigged elections. We should all be hanging our heads in shame that in this day and age, we are still failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Let's not make it 48 years of rigged elections. Thank you very much for those of you who were able to join. And we'll have the usual slot of 7 o'clock UK time tomorrow, or 8 o'clock Zimbabwe time. Thank you again, and have a good night.